Hello, everybody. Welcome to this year's webinar, the second time that we're doing this. It's 4:02, and I know that's pretty close to being exactly on time, but I figure people will jump in as they get here, and we want to get to all the amazing programming we have, so we're just going to get started. I'm Megan Halpern. I'm the SVP at the Blacklist, and welcome. This is...
Hi, I'm Katy Jacobs. I'm the Director of Entertainment Partnerships at NRDC. NRDC is the Natural Resources Defense Council. We're one of the world's leading environmental advocacy organizations. We use science, law, policy, and communications to solve environmental problems, chief among them the climate crisis. We're thrilled to have you join us today to learn more about the 2022 Climate Storytelling Fellowship and to hear from our partners at the Blacklist and CAA Foundation and the Redford Center, in addition to our own Rewrite the Future team. NRDC's Rewrite the Future program aims to enlist the power of storytelling to help turn the climate crisis around. We work with creatives to encourage more varied and compelling climate stories in entertainment. So if you have a script that reflects the climate crisis in a compelling, realistic, and thoughtful way, we would love for you to submit your story to the fellowship. Fellowship will award $20,000 to 3 select scripts and will connect the 3 writers with industry professionals who will provide creative feedback and support. Applications are open now through November 30th, and our moderator will drop a link in the chat now, I believe. Also, if you have questions for our panelists anytime during the event, please drop them in the chat. We'll be answering them during a Q&A session at the end, and we'd love to hear from you.
Yes, and I will also flag, there is a special Q&A chat box for you all to put your questions in there. And then there is a separate chat for you all to talk amongst yourselves, and that will drop links to the program in, etc. It's a little bit confusing, but I swear we'll all get used to it. So without further ado, because you don't want to listen to Katy and I talk all day, I want to introduce first Franklin Leonard, the founder and CEO of the Blacklist, followed by the CAA team, just to talk a little bit more about why we got involved in this project. So Franklin, over to you.
Hi, can you guys hear me? I'll assume that the answer is yes, unless I hear otherwise. Hi, I'm Franklin Leonard, founder of the Blacklist. And look, we're overjoyed to be partnered for a second year with NRDC, the CAA Foundation, and the Redford Center. As has already been mentioned, to provide 3 screenwriters with $20,000 grants and 6 months of mentorship focused on climate storytelling. I'm particularly excited to be here today and have Elise Greven and Treem talk about climate storytelling generally and their specific experience in our inaugural year. The reason that the Blacklist is involved in this is pretty straightforward. I don't think I need to go into a terrible amount of detail making the argument that we have long been in an urgent climate crisis that demands immediate action. But I will quote one of my favorite actors to explain why this particular partnership is action that needs taking. And this is from Alan Rickman. And the quote goes as follows. The more that we're governed by idiots and have no control over our destinies, the more we need to tell stories to each other about who we are, why we are, where we come from, and what might be possible. I think that's true on many fronts, and possibly none more important than the climate reality that we face at this moment. And as an organization dedicated to identifying and celebrating great writers telling great stories, here we are. So if you have a script on the Blacklist website, or you have a script period that engages with climate storytelling, submit it before the November 30th deadline. If you don't have a script that engages climate storytelling and you are a writer, consider writing one. We need them, all of us, everywhere. And thank you for being here. And I'll be back for the Q&A. I'll hand it back to Megha.
Hey everyone, I'm Adam Umhafer. We here at the CAA Foundation are proud to continue our partnership with NRDC, the Blacklist, and the Redford Center for a second year. It's critically important now more than ever that our on-screen worlds reflect the reality of the climate crisis, and more importantly, highlight solutions. Climate storytelling is a compelling method to spark meaningful action and envision a livable future for our planet. And it's vitally important to provide resources to creatives doing this work. We are excited to see this year's fellowship awardees, and we know their stories will inspire conversations, ideas, and action for a healthy and sustainable future for generations to come. Thank you.
All right. So we are incredibly excited to introduce you all to Sarah Treem and Elise Greven. Elise was one of our inaugural 3 fellows last year, where she workshopped with Sarah her script Silent Spring about the environmental activist Rachel Carson.
And you all probably already know Sarah Treem, the co-creator and showrunner of the Golden Globe-winning Showtime drama The Affair. We're going to turn it over to them now to talk about their experience in the inaugural year of our fellowship program and to hear their insights into how to tell compelling climate stories. Take it away, Elise and Sarah.
Hi. I thought I could open by throwing a question to Sarah. What inspired you to incorporate climate storylines into The Affair? What were your inspirations? What was your thought process? Tell us all about what brought you that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, but it wasn't necessarily such a, I didn't think it was going to be such a political act as it seemed to turn out to be interpreted by the viewers. But it was just that we were putting a story in the future. We were putting a story like 30 years into the future in a coastal community. So it seemed pretty likely that community was going to be severely impacted by climate change. So it just seemed like the right way to tell that story. I mean, we had been, sort of realistic up until that point in terms of like the reality of living in that community. So it didn't seem like there was a way to tell it without incorporating the likelihood of what was going to happen to that community.
And for you personally, I've heard you speak before about the grain inside you that drew you to feel really drawn to or compelled to tell those kind of stories as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, we have talked about this before, but I think that it's an anxiety, obviously, that most of us are wrestling with. I think I particularly have felt it more acutely since having children. But it's hanging over all of our heads, whether I think we're, sort of willing to engage consciously with it or not. It's obviously happening. And, our lives are being affected by it. The world is being affected by it, in sort of personal ways and global ways and communities, in culture. And so I think that storytelling, like all good storytelling, basically comes from this idea of some sort of unspoken anxiety that you're wrestling with, that you don't necessarily maybe even have words for, but it is it is affecting your actions in that way, that the sort of thing that is keeping you up at night sort of pervades everything. So I think climate change as a storyline is tough because people feel that it's too big of a story to tell, effectively. It's happening too slowly. It's hard to kind of put a pinpoint in terms of what exactly is happening. But I think when you think about your own experience with the anxiety of climate change, there's a way to start to personalize the story a little bit more and give it to your characters. And it's just a new frontier for us, but that happens every generation, you specifically can see that in horror films, they talk about how different horror films over the last century sort of reveal the anxiety of the moment, like the bomb, people like outer space, aliens, monsters, the war, everything. You can kind of interpret, a society's collective anxiety by what the monster is in the horror film of the day. But just like, nuclear proliferation was a new thing at a certain point, and then we had to figure out how incorporate it in our storytelling, like climate change, is a newish anxiety for us. And we have to figure out how to incorporate it in our storytelling, but it absolutely can be done. And I think, maybe we should talk a little bit about your brilliant screenplay and where that came from.
I mean,
yeah.
I definitely shared that anxiety, and also, I started working on it a few years ago, and I was inspired by Rachel Carson because in her time, she gathered a bunch of information about something that had a diffuse effect. It was hard to pin down and it was happening in small ways all over. And she tried to tell that truth. And in her time, that truth eventually was heard and the science was believed, and she testified before Congress, and then things changed for the better.
Mm-hmm.
And I so needed that to be true in our moment now. So I'd known about her for years and wanted to write about her. And that was the thing that really pushed me to write about her now. I just desperately needed a positive action story for myself to think about how change was possible. Yeah, so definitely those feelings were what drew me to telling that version of that story.
Yeah, and I feel like you did such an amazing job in that screenplay of personalizing it, of making it a story that was, yes, about, she was a scientist, so that she is a scientist, so that sort of helped in terms of, incorporating the personal and the political into the same storyline. But do you want to talk a little bit about how you kind of wove what was happening with her on a character level with what was happening on a sort of, global geothermal level?
Yeah, I mean, I will say it was a surprise to me because I was very mission driven, and the idea was so big, and the climate issues are so big, and I like a big project. I like doing research. I like sort of all of the big scope. And when people read my script, once it was through several drafts and kind of working, people usually, what they spoke to me about was the love story, almost universally. And even people who were science minded, the NRDC team and other foundations said, well, we really connect with the love story, which was a surprise to me. And because I thought I was doing a story that was so big, and I'm talking to myself here, but it is a reminder that emotional connection is what's going to invite people into those stories, even if it's about big ideas, even if it's about things that are mission driven.
Right.
Because it's a climate story, doesn't suspend the rules of gravity of any story we'd want to tell or connect with. And because we're not writing white papers or, New Yorker articles, the way that we invite people in is through, I think, that emotional life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that even on the affair, part of what we had always said was that Montauk itself was like a character in the show for us. It was such a personal place, and it was such a personal place to the characters themselves. And, we loved it so much that the way that we thought about what happened to that place was actually almost as if it was another relationship that the characters had, which was interesting. I don't think that I necessarily understood that until we started to write about it. But my feeling was that that our relationship to the environment is the same as our relationship. Basically, in any relationship, it will sustain as a healthy relationship if you continue to put attention and effort and care into it. And it's the same for interdynamic relationships between people as it is with, our relationship as a species to this place that we call home. If we don't, just as if you don't sort of care for a love affair, it will fall apart eventually, and sort of self-destruct. So if you don't, care for your environment and you don't care for the world, it will also eventually fall apart. And I think that when I was young, I didn't necessarily even, it was such a shock to me when I realized that the weather could possibly change. Because I think we had just all, that seasons might evolve, that we might, that all these, that the Gulf Stream might not always be there. I mean, all this stuff that we had absolutely taken for granted as kids growing up in the 80s, it has changed now. And it was it really was a terrible shock for me when I realized that that was happening. But I had this sense like, right, of course, because nothing sustains forever without effort. Like nothing, there's nothing in the whole world is in stasis. Everything is constantly changing, and it's just depending on, like, is it changing towards a place where we want it to go, or is it changing towards some place, that we're terrified of? And that's really up to us. So in some ways, I actually felt like once I understood that even the climate was as vulnerable as personal relationships are to disappearing, it helped me actually in an interesting way, like understand the climate as a character and be able to sort of write a story that incorporated it. But I think maybe you started out with the climate itself as like a shifting foundation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely kind of took the subject matter of climate DDT in the 50s, 60s as a metaphor for, climate effects in the same way that Don't Look Up uses an asteroid.
Right.
So I was really going kind of head on environmentalism, climate, but I thought a lot more about it, and it was so refreshing talking to the NRDC team, because I had an idea about what a climate story was, and it was the cliche of apocalyptic, a very like depressed, sad, sparse future. And they were really excited about all kinds of stories with all kinds of emotional tones and all kinds of genres. And that really opened my mind up to what a climate story would be. So working within the grain of my interests, like I love research, I love a big, like, investigate the thing, I love the insider and spotlight. So that was like in the grain of what I already loved.
Yeah.
But if what someone loves is like a tender coming of age story, I think it speaks to what you were just saying, because if you don't know your place in the world, you're trying to go out and find where you belong in the world, like because our world is changing, I feel like that maps on to
and
those
I think
kind of feelings.
Right, this rising generation is going to be so much of a fabric of their experience of living, and as and it's all their sort of self-discovery stories will, I think, involve climate change for sure, and wrestling with that, and this question about like whether this generation is going to have children or not, and I mean it's all like these are new questions, and so I think they're quite exciting actually, from a storyteller's perspective, because it's like, oh, new fertile ground, like not that nobody's ever asked these questions before, but I mean, there's only like I think for storytellers, like, there's only so many stories under the sun. And it's so you're never going to reinvent the wheel of storytelling. What you're going to do is basically take a new world and take a classic story and put the classic story into the new world and see what happens. And that, that's how we tell stories over and over again in order to live. We're basically explaining the current world to ourselves based on ancient archetypes. So I feel like sometimes, as you say, like when people think of climate change stories, they think like, oh, I have to tell a disaster story in order to tell a climate change story. But the truth is, no, you really don't. You just need to tell the story of your current moment, basically honestly, but you can tell any of the stories that you were going to tell anyway. They will all sort of fit into, and I think what I loved about your screenplay, honestly, and the reason it was such a revelation to me is that it was a history play about climate change to a certain extent. Like, I think that the assumption is that climate change storylines always have to be future, they always have to be set in the future, basically, like because it's not happening right now, but it is happening right now, or it definitely hasn't happened in the past. But the truth is, I think your story did a beautiful job showing like it's not a problem that just spontaneously burst forward in 2022. The seeds of climate change were very much literally put into the ground, in the 60s and 70s. And so I think that you have done, I'm crossing my fingers for the movie to get made, because I think you've done like a great service in showing us, or in basically showing the story of like how we got here, or what the beginnings of this disaster, where it came from, which will help people again, like kind of contextualize the problem, right? It didn't start from, it just didn't burst forward. It didn't happen. It's been it's been the result of some very deliberate, very small acts, that weren't necessarily considered in their own time.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. I think about the process of change and taking big issues and communicating them. But you were speaking about hoping more things get made. I wonder if people would be interested in how you've seen the temperature of and the entertainment industry be more open to being interested in climate stories. What are you seeing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even the fact that we're sitting here having this conversation, is represents a lot of progress in like the last 3 years. Because I do remember, and being like somewhat shocked when like the affair went into the climate change future in 2019, and that there was such a sort of significant like response to it, because again, it was not a particularly deliberate, act of subversion. It was just it wasn't necessarily something that we were thinking about it as a like political statement. It was just, it seemed like the right way to tell that part of the story. But I think that in 2019 seemed very sort of like deliberate or something, and confrontational. And now I think we're seeing, I loved Don't Look Up. I loved it. And I think we're seeing, and I know Dorothy was working on something, I think for Apple about climate change, like some sort of anthology series or something. So I think it's starting to percolate. It's becoming part of the zeitgeist, which is good. I mean, it is part of the zeitgeist. That's literally what's happening right now. And that's great, because the zeitgeist is what basically feeds storytelling in any generation. And so my sense is that if you can tell a story about climate right now, you're literally tapping into the zeitgeist. And if you're tapping into the zeitgeist, you have more of a, chance of being, successfully produced. So I feel like it's quite positive, from the efforts of people like you and people like this group. And, it didn't just happen, but it is happening.
I will say as a hopeful note that there's some managers, producers that I had been in networking events or things before, who I'd met many times, and when I met them again, they're like, "Oh, you seem familiar." It's from hearing about the NRDC Blacklist Fellowship. We all paid attention to seeing that announcement, and people who I definitely met in person who had no memory of me, but they noticed the fellowship, and that was of interest to them as a piece of business too.
Yeah, which is great.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Blacklist.
Yeah. I think we may be done. I just saw a 2-minute warning.
Yeah. I could talk to you forever about all these things, of course.
We can come back for the question and answer. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Heather Fipps, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm joining from the traditional lands of the Tongva people, and I'm the program manager at the Redford Center. And I'm joined today by Megha Agrawal Sood, and she is the director at Doc Society and leads the Doc Society Climate Story Unit. And she is also an incredible advisor to the Redford Center. So I'm going to join her in conversation, and we'll talk a little bit about our work and how it intersects with climate storytelling. But first, I'd love to share a little bit about the Redford Center, who is a partner of the Climate Storytelling Fellowship, and would like to thank the NRDC and CAA Foundation and the Blacklist for hosting us here today. And just to share a little bit about the Redford Center, it was co-founded in 2005 by Robert Redford and his son, James Redford. And the Redford Center advances environmental solutions through the power of stories that move. And as an independent nonprofit organization, we invest in stories that provide solutions and inspire action and hope. And to give you just a little bit of insight to that, I'm going to show a little clip of our work that sets up how we think about environmental storytelling, and then I'll kick off my conversation with Megha.
Things happen because this community has power.
all of these things, you could tie and connect to climate change.
There really needs to be a cultural shift.
We have a lot to learn from our Native American friends.
Shifting the power back into the hands of people who have been marginalized. This is how we celebrate life.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And would love to have Megha introduce about the Doc Society Climate Story Unit as well. Take it away, Megha.
Yeah, thanks so much, Heather, for inviting me into the conversation. Thrilled to be here. As a quick introduction, my name is Megha Sood. My pronouns are she, her. I am based in the unceded lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne, also known as Boulder, Colorado. And I'm with an organization called Doc Society. We have been supporting independent storytellers from across the globe for over 17 years. But a few years ago, we made an intentional effort around climate storytelling, and that's when we launched the Climate Story Unit, really dedicated to supporting a wave of climate-themed stories that really center the perspectives of those who are on the front lines of the emergency, and also that are very creatively and compelling and really resonate with who we are as humans. There are a lot of different ways that we support storytellers, everything from a fund that gives out up to $100,000 in production and impact campaign supports to labs that we have all across the world, but we'll get into all of that a bit later.
So awesome. So I wanted to ask you to join me in conversation today, Megha, because our work is really in alignment in that for climate storytelling specifically, both of us work with documentary filmmakers and collaborate with so many different groups globally that are working in the environmental movement. And I think we know from our work there that there's an abundance of character-driven climate narratives, incredible stories out there that intersect with nearly every issue. So no matter what anyone's story is about, there's a way to pull real climate issues and real people dealing with climate issues into those stories. And so I wanted to talk to you about really using nonfiction stories, movement groups, and documentaries as a resource for finding inspiration from real people to help make characters and plot lines more dynamic, nuanced, and authentic. And I just want to acknowledge that we don't want to paint the image that we're implying that all stories have to be nonfiction or based in reality. In fact, I really think the opposite. The more imaginative, the more out of this world, the better. But I think there's some real value to writers, specifically in fiction, to pull inspiration from real people and real issues happening right now. So I would love to hear how you think that can inform writing in a great way, Megha.
Yeah, that's a really great prompt. Also, though, before jumping in, I feel like I just have to clarify really quickly, is that while Doc Society's legacy has been in non-fiction documentaries, hence the name Doc Society, actually the Climate Story Unit is open to supporting all mediums, all genres. So we have everything from podcasts and musical dramas and everything in between. So I just want to clarify that, given who the audience is in today's conversation. But yeah, in terms of where we can get inspiration from, right, as we're thinking about storytelling, really what it comes down to is that every person has experienced climate change. Climate is the backdrop of our lives, but how climate is experienced is truly highly determined by where we live and also the color of our skin. So when someone says climate change, some people may think wildfires and hurricanes, but also others may be thinking about immigration, maybe thinking about public health, maybe thinking about gender equity or just transitions. And so in a way, I actually don't really like using the term that something's a climate change story, because climate is so intersectional, right? And the most creative stories are the ones that really lean into that complexity. Historically, climate content in the mainstream has been really alienating. And I think a lot of it, the reason why is because a lot of stories that we've seen prior to all the wonderful ones that were mentioned in today's conversation have really reinforced a lot of the same tropes, right? Like the doom and gloom, the good versus bad, a lot of old white men talking about really beautiful places. These tropes aren't just boring, they're actually harmful, right? They're really creating this perception of who gets to be involved in climate and climate action and who doesn't. Mm-hmm. And, in order for us to get through this emergency, it's going to take all of us working together in really creative and collaborative ways. So an example of a really great story that I've had the privilege to work really closely with that has really leaned into the complexity of climate is actually a featured doc. It's called The Territory. It premiered at Sundance this past year, won the Audience Award, got picked up by National Geographic. It currently is actually in a theatrical release across the US this week, which is insane, and we're so excited about it. But the reason why it's relevant to our conversation right now is because the story really centers the fight of the indigenous Udaway Wow people who are protecting their land in the Amazon from deforestation. But instead of just reducing the storyline to it's the indigenous community versus the government, what makes it so interesting is that it also brings in the perspectives of settlers and the farmers who are also all contributing to the deforestation. But they also all believe that they're doing it for the right reasons. And so I think what the film team has done an amazing job of is really leaning into that complexity of really understanding people's perceptions, how we learn about things, how that forms what we believe is right and wrong. And I think that makes that story a lot more human and a lot more relatable.
Yes, I love that. I mean, I think that what can really be illuminated when looking at real stories is the tension that exists between our own coming to understand of how the climate crisis is affecting us. And I think we can see that on screen a lot of times for real people kind of stepping up with courage and approaching it in their own way. And I think it also can emphasize that not everyone is needing to be an expert to engage with talking about climate change. And I think that's something that I would assume a lot of writers feel like I have to know everything. Climate change can feel like such a big issue to tackle, and you feel like you have to have the solutions in order to write about it, but your characters don't necessarily have to know what to do either. And they can be learning about it along the way. And so if you're looking at it through the lens of everyone is experiencing climate change for the first time, just like you are, then you can really think about how your characters are responding to that in an authentic way that might look different for every person based on their lived experience, how they're stepping up or withholding or showing fear or showing courage.
I think, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I really love that you pulled that out, right? Because I think this perception that you have to be an expert in this topic area is actually one of the biggest reasons why there's a lot of disengagement and even apathy towards getting involved in climate. And that's, again, thinking about who are the trusted messengers that are perceived in narratives in mainstream media talking about climate. I personally was so intimidated about getting involved in anything climate related. And then I realized, I was like, wait a second, I am a first generation daughter of immigrants. I grew up in Houston, Texas, like the oil gas capital of the world, while experiencing hurricanes on an annual basis, right? Like I have lived through climate change. And actually, if I lean into and understanding unpacking my own experience, there's so much richness that is there to pull from. And that being said, too, I think there's a lot of inspiration that can be taken from also thinking of other communities outside of your own and what are their lived experiences. I think always the caveat about that is, thinking about as you're going about that process, how do you ensure you're not unintentionally reinforcing extractive practices, right? So if you're approaching someone else and getting to understand their story, how are you thinking about what true collaboration looks like? How do you think what credit is, what's compensation like? And these are actually all questions that we are asking ourselves really critically in the documentary world too, which are actually questions that were not very much asked just even a few years ago. And actually one of my favorite resources that are out there to really guide that is this amazing resource developed by Nia Taro, which is an incredible organization that supports Indigenous filmmakers across the globe. And not only do they have this amazing network of Indigenous storytellers to be collaborating with, they have also developed a guide on how to really be doing it in a truly participatory and collaborative way and not extractive. And I think it's really exciting to see resources in that conversation happen. And I'm excited to see how that will be replicated in the fiction world too.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for sharing that resource. So grateful. And also would love to share a couple of thoughts as you're thinking about entering into your stories. Go on a listening and learning tour, talk with the people in your own life, and see what their different perspectives are on the same issues and examine why. I think even people in our own circles are coming at climate issues from very different understandings and very different timelines of which they're interacting with it. And so we have a question for the audience to prompt some creative thinking, which is, what climate impacts do you see in your own lives and communities? And if you want to put them in the chat, we'd love to see them. So what climate impacts do you see in your own lives and your communities? And as you're thinking about maybe that as an entry point into a story of your experience, think about, does everyone feel the same effects of those climate impacts? And does everyone feel the same about those impacts? Little creative prompt for us. Would love to see. Urban sprawl. Oh, so important in Los Angeles. Ocean quality.
And Heather, I think we got the 2-minute warning too. So
great. Thank you.
As all this amazingness comes in.
Well, I just wanted to follow up with one last question for you, Megha, because I personally, I feel that every story will have an impact, whether you plan for it to or not, because media is an incredibly influential medium. What potential do screenwriters have for real world impact? And could you share a little bit about your work in that space?
Yeah, I'll try to do like the 40-second version, right? But the role of culture and why it's so important is because this is how we rewrite mental models of what we think is possible. So if we as storytellers, right, really support stories that are for, by, and other communities, stories that can really activate all of the range of our emotions, as we mentioned, right, the romantics, the thrill seekers, the comedians, stories that really can make these manifestations of what a more climate just and safe future for all of us looks like, that really has the possibility to propel momentum. And, when we talk about solutions, just also want to quickly clarify, it doesn't need to just be tech solutions, right? It's solutions that are about what does it look like when a family has to adapt and build resilience to climate change? What does it look like when oil rig workers are organizing for more safer and equitable jobs through that green energy transition? What does it look like if a world actually honored Indigenous knowledge and returned land back to Indigenous communities, right? These are also solutions and futures that we can all be a part of. And that is really, truly the role of storytellers, is to actually help us imagine that this is possible, even when the politicians in the headlines say that it's not. And if we really lean into that, that's where that courage that we're all looking for will really be coming for.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much, Megha, for joining me in this conversation, and so looking forward to seeing the beautiful futures that you all imagine in your stories. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megha and Heather. That was inspiring. I'm Daniel Hinerfeld, Director of Rewrite the Future at NRDC, and I'm here with my brilliant colleague, Meredith Milton, who will say a word about her background.
I'm Meredith Milton. I'm a creative consultant to the Rewrite the Future team. I'm also a producer, and I was a studio executive for a long time. I've worked at Searchlight and Lionsgate and Summit over the course of my career.
And I'll just add that I used to run NRDC's documentary unit. And so that last conversation was particularly fascinating to me. And I think you're right on the money that looking for real stories is such an important part of the creative process in scripted entertainment. So what we're going to do is just give a really abbreviated version of a presentation that we give pretty much on a weekly basis to Hollywood professionals in different contexts. And it's kind of like a primer on climate storytelling, just to get people's minds thinking about these topics that I think a lot of creatives in Hollywood aren't yet quite thinking about. So, Rewrite the Future was founded basically in order to promote and support, climate change storytelling in film and TV. And it's just based on the insight that good stories have the power to change hearts and minds. And really at this point, the climate fight is largely a communications fight. And so the contribution that Hollywood can make is really outsized at this point. So Rewrite the Future works with entertainment companies and creators, including Apple TV, NBC Universal, Netflix, and Sony, among other media companies. And we organize our work around 5 verticals. So we produce public discussions about climate storytelling, for instance, at Sundance. We do this. We encourage new voices through the Climate Storytelling Fellowship with the Blacklist, the Redford Center, and CAA Foundation. We spend a lot of time consulting on TV shows and films. We write about climate storytelling, including a chapter in a forthcoming book from Springer. And we also educate creative professionals with presentations and workshops. So we're going to dive into one of those presentations. So our progress on climate change has been slow, in part because we're telling ourselves the wrong stories about it, that it's not urgent or even real, that we have plenty of time to address it, or that it's already too late, too expensive, and too big to fix, and that one person can't make a difference. These stories, some of which are promoted by the fossil fuel industry, are not only wrong, but they invite complacency and they slow us down. We need to tell new climate stories that can help people see and feel the urgency of the problem and the need to move quickly. Understand that we already have nearly everything we need to solve the crisis, get excited about building a better future, and that motivates people to let go of their attachment to the status quo and get behind the big changes we need to make. Your power to create and influence new climate stories is critical to shifting our culture and accelerating solutions. News and documentaries contribute to our cultural views on climate, but entertainment storytelling has the capacity to influence as well, and maybe even more. That's because entertainment reaches those who mistrust or tune out the news or other sources of factual information. And good stories have a unique capacity to transport the viewer, which has powerful psychological effects. Research shows that when we're caught up in a good story, we enter into an open and receptive state in which we easily absorb and retain information and emotionally identify with and care about the characters, even though they may be very different than we are. It turns out the more entertaining a story is, the more potential it has to influence attitudes and behavior. For example, one of the few scripted features that's all about climate, The Day After Tomorrow, had a significant impact on climate risk perceptions, policy priorities, and even on the voting intentions of moviegoers. Hollywood often uses the power of stories to promote social change, but so far, it hasn't tackled climate change with similar determination, especially considering the scale of the crisis. The media have picked up on this. Is Hollywood doing enough to fight the climate crisis? Variety wondered. Why is Hollywood so scared of climate change? Asked the New York Times. When climate does make it to the screen, it's often confined to documentaries. In scripted entertainment, climate mainly comes up in disaster stories, dystopic future stories, or Planet B stories, where the only hope for humanity is to escape to a new world. These stories can be entertaining, and they help raise the alarm. But we also need stories that seed hope and that inspire action. Why are there so few climate stories overall? And why does Hollywood tend to tell the same ones over and over? Writers say they're concerned that climate is complicated, abstract, potentially boring, and that it can be divisive and depressing. Another factor may be that writers themselves find the issue psychologically challenging. We get it, but we also believe that new ways of thinking about climate change can turn these perceived hurdles into creative opportunities. The climate component of a story can be explicit or implicit, and it can vary in scale and significance along a continuum, from a mere passing verbal or visual reference to a character motivation or to a main driver of plot. For example, The Day After Tomorrow puts climate change front and center. It drives the plot. Moving across the continuum, we have films like Leave No Trace, in which the main character's relationship to nature is central to the story. And then we have series like Parks and Rec, where it's showcasing and normalizing, for instance, a main character's veganism. Our first suggestion to storytellers is simply to reflect our current climate reality. Climate change already affects most of us, whether or not our house has burned up or been washed away in a flood. We worry about it. We talk about it with our partners and friends. People wonder whether it makes sense to have children, or where is the safest place to live, or what they can possibly do to help. Reflecting this reality is an important first step. Dorothy Fortenberry, who's come up already today, is an EP on The Handmaid's Tale, as well as the upcoming Apple climate change series, Extrapolations, created by Scott Z. Burns. In our climate storytelling panel, Beyond Apocalypse, at the 2021 Sundance Film Festival, Dorothy said this.
I think any story can and probably should be a climate change story. I think it's sort of like, you know, are walls entertaining? Like, I don't know, but most TV shows have them. Like, you know, climate change is just as much a part of our reality as walls. So like, it should be in TV shows as much as walls are. And like, maybe the episode is about the walls, or maybe they're just there, but they influence everybody's decisions because you have to go, you know, around them or through a door or whatever. So I think there's a part of me that feels like if we just made a small adjustment to make it reality, that would be enormous.
As you know, good stories are not about issues, they're about people. Though climate might seem huge and impersonal, the truth is we made the climate crisis, we are impacted by it, and we will be the ones to solve it too. To find the story in the seemingly abstract problem of climate, character and setting are great places to start. You can find the specific ways your characters are touched by the climate crisis through attributes like where they live and work, or their interests and beliefs, or by the way climate impacts their emotions and psychological states. Since many shows and films are centered around the workplace, characters' jobs can be an easy way in. Political and legal shows are among the low-hanging fruit here. We've already seen climate topics picked up in shows like The Politician, Mr. Mayor, and Madam Secretary. First responder shows also have a lot of dramatic potential, given our new normal of killer heat waves, superstorms, and year-round wildfire seasons. Because every place in the world is now affected by climate change, settings are another rich angle. This is a still from a 30 years in the future storyline in The Affair that showed how sea level rise destroyed the oceanside town of Montauk, Long Island, which we were discussing earlier. But settings can just as easily highlight climate solutions. For instance, an Appalachian coal town transitioning to renewable energy, or a Midwestern farming collective practicing regenerative agriculture. The photo here is of Apricot Lane, AKA the biggest little farm in Moorpark, California. The climate reality we're living in evokes strong feelings like anxiety, fear, anger, shame, grief, and loss. We're starting to see a few stories that realistically depict climate anxiety. Notably, these often involve parents worried about children and young people worried about their futures. Audiences need help dealing with the sharpening generational rift on climate, the growing sense of abandonment and anger among the young. Here's what Sarah Treem had to say about climate emotions in our panel, Beyond Apocalypse.
What we were trying to do for the show, and what I think is interesting to think about when you think about incorporating climate change into narratives, is that people are very worried actually about climate change. It's a real anxiety, and it's hanging over all of us. And we're all kind of in denial about it because it's too scary to think about. It involves the legacy of our children. It involves like the world that we're leaving them. We don't actually feel like we have any control over it. And so, but that kind of anxiety is a real character motivator. Like anything else, like any other kind of thing that the character is in denial about, like any other thing that the character doesn't want to see. But is significantly influencing their actions. It's very much something that you could incorporate into character.
Climate change also tends to compound other forms of inequality. For instance, people often die from heat stroke because they can't afford air conditioning. Families lose homes because low-income subdivisions are sometimes built in floodplains. Black teens suffer much higher rates of asthma because of worse air pollution in their communities. This compounding effect escalates injustice, and it's also grist for storytelling. As the environmentalist Van Jones said, imagine what might happen if a police officer mistook an asthma inhaler for a weapon. Actions and policies that move toward equity, diversity, and inclusion tend to alleviate the worst climate impacts. Without exposure to climate solutions, it's easy for people to get stuck in what Tony Leiserowitz of Yale has called the hope gap, the despair of not knowing how to save the world from burning up. Stories can help to change that by showing characters learning about what they can do to help. As Greta Thunberg says, hope comes from taking action. When likable characters get excited about joining the climate fight through lifestyle changes, political activism, and supporting green policies in their communities, viewers will be inspired to action too. We'd love to see climate solutions, big and small, get more screen time, and also a range of future visions that connect the dots between the choices we make today and the world our descendants will live in. Not just the dystopias where we fail to meet the crisis, but more positive, thriving, and equitable futures where we succeed. Positive futures needn't be devoid of drama. You can still have murders, affairs, and corruption in a future with a green economy. Climate stories can also appeal across the political spectrum. Characters who care about the environment don't all need to be politically liberal. They can be based on conservative people embracing the green transition. For example, a Texas oil worker who retrains as a wind engineer, or a preacher who believes in protecting God's creation. The climate angles we've been discussing can work in almost any genre, from dramas like Madam Secretary and Yellowstone to comedies. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia did an episode called The Gang Solves Global Warming. We're also starting to see climate mentions in green behaviors in sitcoms like The Conners and dramedies like Dead to Me and Insecure. Big Little Lies also addressed the surge in climate anxiety among children. Sci-fi shows like The Expanse and Mars explore what happens when our extractive economy moves into the solar system. And action adventures offer opportunities for saving the world storylines. And reality shows are unnatural. In Long Way Up, Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman ride from Argentina to LA on electric Harleys. A new wave of award-winning, critically acclaimed content is tackling environmental issues and resonating with audiences around the world. Adam McKay's climate allegory, Don't Look Up, was an unquestionable success for Netflix, shattering global viewership records and earning 4 Oscar nominations. Jurassic World Dominion, which grossed nearly $1 billion worldwide, features a giant food corporation that exploits dinosaur genetics as a means of dominating the global food supply, with disastrous consequences. Best Picture winner Parasite dramatized the disproportionate impact climate change has on the rich and the poor, featuring a catastrophic flood that destroys one family's basement apartment while leaving the other family to muse, "Did you see the sky today? Crystal clear, 0 air pollution. Rain washed it all away." Season 2 of the hit show Ted Lasso features a multi-episode arc in which a Nigerian player discovers one of the team's sponsors is responsible for destroying the environment in his homeland. He rallies his teammates to tape over the airline's name on their jerseys, publicly raising awareness of the issue and causing the company to be banned from doing business in Nigeria. His father later tells him that he's the butterfly whose wings made this happen. Recent history shows that environmental storytelling can succeed creatively and financially, but we aren't seeing nearly enough of it. As the next generation of storytellers, you have an unusual ability to influence the culture and speed up climate solutions. Together, we can bring the people of the world to the tipping point where individual and collective action on climate change becomes a certainty. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Meredith and Daniel. We're now going to open it up for some audience Q&A. So if the panelists want to turn their cameras back on, we can all be here. And Megan, you want to pull some questions with me from this chat?
Sure. I will also say thank you to Franklin for being hard at work answering a lot of the technical questions about the fellowship. So if anybody has any of those, they're now in the answered questions with some very thorough answers. But yeah, just to dive in, I'm just going to pick a question randomly. And this I would say is for anybody, what resources would you all recommend for early career writers that are interested in including climate narratives in their story? Obviously outside of our annual webinar, which is the #1 resource.
I'll take a stab at this, and I'm really just going to steal from Dorothy Fortenberry. I think if we're talking about telling climate stories, it really is that everything can and probably should be a climate storytelling in the way that everything is a wall story. So if you're an early career writer looking to include climate narratives in your stories, anywhere where there is climate work being done or discussed is a place where you can educate yourself about how to include climate storytelling in your narratives. Beyond that, I think it's just any resource that will make you a better writer and more apt and more capable of telling compelling emotional stories and incorporating that climate storytelling in there are probably the resources that are going to be most valuable for you as an early career writer trying to transition to a professional writer who also wants to include climate storytelling in their work.
Let me just jump in and say that, there are so many fantastic climate podcasts, which to me are very provocative. And one I'll tout is by our own colleague at NRDC, Mary Heglar. And she has a podcast that she does with Amy Westerfelt called Hot Take, which is great. And then there are just so many fantastic writers at this point, mainstream journalists at the New Yorker, the New York Times, and other publications. It's great to follow them on Twitter. And, they are really the advance guard on what's happening around the world and where we could be going.
I had another thought maybe too, that I think that people respond to authenticity. So I don't think you have to do something radically different than what you're trying to do as a writer in the first place, which is write the kind of stories you're compelled to write. So like, if you love a police procedural, like there's a way into that involves climate. You don't have to write a different kind of story than what you really, really desperately, the reason you want to write anything like has a climate story in it probably already. Like I'm waiting for someone to write about all the lakes where bodies keep showing up that got dumped by the mob. Like, I love a police procedural, but I feel like if you graft on climate onto a story in an authentic way, people will smell that too. So I just think that, like Sarah and I were talking about, if there's these kind of tropes of stories that follow a shape, you're probably drawn to some of them. And there's probably an emotional grain in what the characters are hoping for, trying to figure out, that probably goes with some emotional aspect of climate. So write the stories you want to write and make them great, probably, which is the hard thing, right?
I'd also love to share a couple that I think a lot of people on this call have contributed to. The Good Energy Project's Playbook for Screenwriting in the Age of Climate Change is a really great starting place and has a lot of great resources for writers. And also encourage you to check out Earth Justice's Lit, Stories from the Front Lines of Climate Justice, which is some narrative stories about characters on the front lines. And Intersectional Environmentalist also has a lot of great resources to follow and get a very complex look at a lot happening in the environmental movement. So those are some great ones to check out.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. This next question is for Sarah. This is from Tyler. And the question is, I'm interested in how the network or others in positions of power responded to the idea of a climate theme in the affair.
That's a good question. They didn't love it. They weren't crazy about it. I think they felt that it wasn't the show, which I think is fair. You know, like that's fair. That it was a leap for the show for sure. And the interesting thing that I found, and this is not necessarily about climate, but that a little bit of like future goes a long way in storytelling. Like the truth is that we actually are not really able to conceptualize what will probably be true in 30 years. Because if you think about like 30 years ago and all the things that we didn't know were going to be part of this world, it would have been very hard, for example, to like understand like why everybody was constantly looking at something in their hands, like all day, every day. You know, if you had tried to put that into a future narrative, maybe even in like the early 90s, it might have been, it's just distracting. If you haven't seen it yet, it's just distracting. It sort of takes over your story. So that was something that I did find was kind of problematic, to take a story that had been basically set in like a pretty naturalistic environment and then try to put it 30 years in the future without it feeling sci-fi. That was a very tricky thing. And I'm not sure that we actually did it particularly well, but you know, you don't have a lot of time in television to figure out new worlds and stuff like that. So we were operating on a limited time in order to figure out some of this stuff. But they didn't love it. But again, that was 3 years ago, and it was not how the show had been conceptualized. So I think that has to be sort of taken into account when thinking about it. But the thing that I was going to say to the last question in terms of like how to start out writing about climate change is that like, I really do agree with Elise. Like, I think that my idea for drama is always that you just put two people in a room who have like a very good reason to be furious at each other, and you don't let them leave. And the room can be anything, you know, it can be an actual room, like no exit, you know, but it can also be an office, it can be a family, you know, it can be a situation, it can be a planet. But because we kind of all are stuck in a room together at this point, you know, and we have a very good reason to be furious at each other because we may all die from this, you know, and like none of us can leave. I mean, except for Elon Musk, but otherwise than that, we're sort of stuck here. So I do think that there are sort of classic tropes of storytelling that absolutely do work in the climate change world. It's just about like letting it not stop being sort of other, and letting it start being, you know, part of your life.
I feel like it's an interesting compliment to that. Someone has asked what it was like working with the experts at NRDC. So I'm curious, both Elise, for you and for Sarah, what it has been like incorporating that research in a way that feels authentic to the drama, but also authentic to the research and the science itself. I feel like that's always kind of a line to walk. And I'm curious, on top of that, and for everyone else that is out there that is interested in the fellowship specifically, what it was like working with the experts at NRDC in that space as well.
I got the amazing opportunity to get my script reviewed by scientists at the NRDC to make sure that my script had a lot of science in it, and to get a check on whether I had portrayed that accurately. And that just relieved so much worry for me about, you know, being accurate and not putting out more misinformation. So that was amazing. And just everyone at the NRDC and Rewrite the Future is so committed to telling these stories and that felt incredibly gratifying and exciting to like be a little bit part of a team who's trying to go the same direction. I felt incredibly supported. It was amazing.
And I think the thing about writing about science in general is that, like, a good rule of thumb, and I learned this years ago from Lynn Nonage actually, was that she said that she would do all the research until she had to start writing, basically. Like, she would spend a complete amount of time just like diving into the research of whatever she was working on. And then when she had to write, she sort of knew that, and she would put the research aside. And I just think in writing in general, writing about climate change, writing about science, writing about anything that's research heavy, it's really good advice to like do the research, spend the time doing the research, give the research its due, and then put it aside and write the story. Because I think sometimes if you're trying to basically write the research, you know, it gets kind of heavy-handed and dull.
So I see another question in the chat that's for our NRDC team. So for Daniel and Meredith, can you share some of your success stories from being script consultants in Hollywood, and what lessons have come from that work about where Hollywood needs the most help to tell authentic climate stories?
I'll quickly share one success story. I think that we were consulting recently on a scripted feature, and both of us, both Meredith and I, sort of had the same nagging sort of issue about the project, which was that there was something missing in the fundamental conflict amongst the two groups of characters. And we realized that there was a perfectly natural conflict that was waiting to be used that involved the environment. And when we explained our thinking about it, one of the creators of the film said, "That's really interesting, and I think you've solved a really important story problem for us." And that kind of recognition that climate can actually, climate and in the environment can really drive the story and introduce a whole other realm of conflict and character that creates creative opportunity. Meredith, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I love that example. It's really funny because I was thinking of the exact same one. You know, I think, and I think the other thing that I'll say that's been really interesting that we've learned is that obviously everyone that you speak with has a preconception about what they think that climate storytelling consists of. And what we like the most about our work is when people send us kind of, or talk to us about all the projects that they're working on that maybe aren't even necessarily climate stories. And sometimes we even read a script and then we'll, you know, get on Zoom and be like, I don't know, where is it in this one? And you can always find it. There's always a way that feels organic. And then, you know, what we'll do is just go back to the, you know, the writer, the director, the execs, whoever they are, and just give them, you know, the sort of a menu of options. These are the different ways we think it could crop up, you choose. But I think it's been really interesting, even for us, when we don't see it the first time we look, and then all of a sudden it's there.
For the other panelists, and also Danielle and Meredith, for you, but do you all have favorite examples of climate storytelling? Maybe even things that might be thought of as climate stories on the face of it?
I mean,
obviously, like, you know, yeah, go ahead.
This is a really random one, but it popped into my mind because we were just talking about it this morning. The SpongeBob musical, which is, I don't know if you guys remember, it's the end of the world, like, you know, the apocalypse is coming, it's SpongeBob, and like things really couldn't be more dire. It's kind of a Don't Look Up scenario, but with, like, I think, a volcano. But it's a musical, it's hilarious, and you come out of it feeling like this incredible sense of community. You know, it's a community that breaks through the course of the stress of, you know, this threat, and then it's a community that heals. And I don't know, I think that those are the kinds of things when we're thinking about content that can invite people in and uplift people, but still deal with climate. Those are the kinds of examples that I look for.
Yeah, and I think I think Independence Day is a great is like a very early version of a climate change story, because I tried to show it to my kids the other day and they got freaked out because it's a little scary. They didn't like the aliens, but Jeff Goldblum is recycling the whole time, and everybody's making fun of him, and he's constantly recycling, and then he is the hero of the story who ends up saving the world, not necessarily because he's a recycler, but like that's just part of his sort of character and the indication that he's a good guy. And when I went back and looked at it, I was like, oh, that's so fascinating, actually, that that was part of the way that the storyteller told you that Jeff Goldblum was like a character that you could trust because he recycled. So.
I think this happened in a movie that came out in 2021, but if not, I'm virtually certain that it will in the next installment. And if it doesn't, I'll be shocked, frankly. But the Fast and Furious franchise, Vin either drives an electric Dodge Charger in Fast 9 or almost certainly will in Fast 10. That's also climate storytelling. And I think that, especially when you take a franchise that has been built on the notion of combustion engines and makes a transition and has its hero in an electric vehicle, that means something. That, sticks with its audience that is not going in thinking about climate, but may come out thinking, what's cool? Electric vehicles. And that substantively matters. We talk about changing hearts and minds. You don't do it by being didactic. You do it by presenting people with a vision for the world that's more compelling than the one they live in now. And that's the stuff that I often most respond to.
Great. So I know we're a little bit over time, but one last question. Several people in the chat are talking about the recent legislative wins and the Inflation Reduction Act have offered hope while, illuminating the long road that is ahead of us in the climate fight. Curious for all the panelists, what is giving you hope as we all move forward?
I have one. There's something called Wright's law, which is similar to Moore's law in computing. Like every 18 months, you kind of double computing power in a microchip. I think Wright's law is based on like the Wright brothers, that the cumulative production time of anything being produced radically decreases its cost and increases the way that we understand how to make things. And so all of these things are going to make a better, more comfortable future, are just at the tipping point of being really cheap and really accessible. And like, they're still working out the fully fleshed technology of them. And people's understanding of how that could be in their lives in a way that's not a crappier version of what we have right now, but like a better positive version of what we have. So I find that very exciting, that like, I think the US just is 5% electric cars. And they know that once you top past 5%, the rate of adoption is tremendous. So things like that get me excited.
I'll add something. This almost sounds too cute, but I truly mean it. And, we've been doing this work in Hollywood for almost 3 years now. And what I find inspiring is the transition that we've seen, the excitement there is in Hollywood about telling climate stories, reflecting the climate crisis, the number of people in every aspect of the business who are interested in asking questions and wanting to participate. And, events like this, I mean, to see a couple hundred people here today, to me is inspiring. And we're seeing that on a weekly basis throughout the industry.
That feels like a really nice note to end on. Oh, unless Sarah, you have something to say.
Well, I'm just going to add to that, which is that like, I always tell young writers, who are feeling like, when is my career going to sort of take off and become something, that it's a tipping point. So it's like, it feels like nothing's happening and you're just putting stuff out there and like nobody's picking up on it. But what is happening is that people are reading you and they're getting familiar with you. And then it just takes like one sort of person to put your stuff over the ledge. And then suddenly everybody loves you, and they feel like they've loved you all this time and they've always loved you and like they're all behind you. And it's this, I mean, people talk about it a lot. There's no such thing as an overnight success. It's like, you build and you build and you build, and then all of a sudden something finally tips, and then you're kind of you're off to the races. And I think that that's true for the storytelling as well. Like that, you know, as you're saying, like the fact that there are people showing up to this, the fact that you guys have sort of been able to ramp up these programs, and people like Elise are finding success with these specific scripts. Like I feel like there's a tipping point sort of moment that's happening right now, and then like there will be sort of a watershed where this will hit the mainstream, and then everybody will, you know, be like, I've always cared about the environment. You know, I've always wanted to.
Not only will they say they've always cared about it, they'll take credit for the fact that people are paying attention to it.
Well, on behalf of Katy and I and the Blacklist and NRDC and CAA and Redford Foundation, just want to thank everyone for coming. Thank all of our amazing panelists, our previous fellow, Elise, just everyone who's been here. We're so excited to be able to do this program for a second year. So excited everyone's involved. And we really thank you all for sharing your time and taking the time to be here. It means a lot. I know it means a lot to all the writers in the audience. And as a reminder, the deadline for opting into the program is November 30th. If you opt in before October 30th, you'll get a free month of hosting and free evaluation. So we highly, highly encourage you to make our earlier deadline. But if you don't, you have until November 30th. There's a lot of resources on our website, on the NRDC's website. I know that Rebecca and Claire have been dropping those links in the chat throughout. You can reach out to support@blcklst.com if you have any questions at all. We are happy to answer them. And we will also be hosting this webinar recording on our YouTube channel. So you'll be able to go back and revisit and check it out and look up all the questions and answers that you've forgotten. So with that, just a big, big, big thank you to everyone again for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it. All right.
Thank you all so
Bye,
much.
everyone. Good luck.
Have a good night.